welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is a risk management firm specialising in financial crime. Our aim of these podcasts is to bring you interesting news, interviews and recordings of our exclusive events from the world of financial crime. Addressing modern slavery in supply chains. In this podcast, Hope Sherwin, Themis Head of Social Impact, talks to Lord Deben, Chairman of Sancroft, Justine Currell, Executive Director of Unseen, and Imran Rasool, Chief Procurement Officer at Nationwide, about the responsibilities financial institutions have to address modern slavery in their supply chains. We learn about the challenges procurement departments and suppliers may face in identifying and tackling this crime, and the things companies can do to overcome them. You will hear insights and experiences from experts who are at the forefront of tackling modern slavery today.
Hello and welcome to this roundtable discussion on modern slavery and procurement in the financial services industry. My name is Hope Sherwin. As part of our ongoing work looking at modern slavery and human trafficking, we've published a series of podcasts in which we look at various topics relating to modern slavery and the financial services industry. This roundtable discussion today considers how financial institutions can manage modern slavery risk and seek to detect and disrupt the activity within their supply chains through their procurement channels. I'm delighted to welcome a distinguished panel with me today. Lord Deben, Chairman of Sancroft, an international sustainability consultancy that helps some of the world's leading companies improve their environmental, ethical, and social impact. Justine Currell, Executive Director of Unseen, a leading UK charity working to end modern slavery, partnering with a range of stakeholders, including leading financial institutions. Imran Rasool, Chief Procurement Officer at Nationwide. Nationwide is the world's largest mutual financial institution, the UK's second largest mortgage provider, and one of the UK's largest savings providers. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining me today to discuss this important subject. Imran, if I could begin by asking you to set the scene for us. When we talk about procurement in a financial institution such as Nationwide, what exactly are we talking about? I wonder if you could outline for us the range of suppliers you deal with in general terms, what kind of companies you deal with through your procurement function, and approximately how many suppliers you deal with, just to give us a bit of context.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So hi Hope, and hi to the panel. Thanks for having me today on the podcast. It's really great to be here virtually with all of you. So at Nationwide, we, like most organisations, procure goods and services in order to operate our business across the whole range of everything that we do. So some examples, just to give you a feel for the breadth. The energy we use to power our buildings, the IT equipment we use, just to manage all our financial transactions and our branch colleagues, the clothing that our branch colleagues wear, waste management and catering across all our admin buildings. And then we've also got, resourcing partners that we're working with for recruitment and professional services companies for advice. Some of that resourcing partners may be in the UK, or they may be in other countries as well. And then more uniquely, as a financial services provider, we work with suppliers to source credit and debit cards, ATMs, on the street and their maintenance. And we've got debt advice partners to support financially struggling members, as well as working with anti-money laundering and fraud experts. So quite a broad range for our own use. And then for our members themselves, we work in partnership with, for example, insurance products, roadside assistance, mobile and phone and home insurance, as well as mortgage and investment products. So it's a very broad spectrum. We've got approximately 1,100 third parties that we worked with last year on a tier 1 basis. And of those, approximately 50% of them are strategic contracted suppliers, which we work very closely with, and about 50% of them are one or two low transactional PO only suppliers.
That's great, thanks, Imran. That really sets the scene as a very broad range of suppliers that you're working with. Lord Deben, if I could turn to you now to ask you about the work that you've been doing with Sandcroft, and specifically to ask you about your thoughts on why procurement departments should be interested in tackling modern slavery. Some people might say, well, this is an issue for the financial crime team. What would you say to them? Why should procurement departments be concerned with modern slavery?
Well, I think, first of all, that it is part of the change of the way in which we look at our activities in business. I mean, there was a time in which businesses didn't think it was any responsibility for them as to what their particular products did to their customers. I mean, in Victorian days, they watered down the milk and they used chalk to make it coloured, and they did all sorts of things and really didn't feel they had much responsibility for it. Well, gradually we began to realise that if you sell something to the public, you have got to stand by what you promise, and you've got to be safe, and a whole series of other things. And then we began to understand that the people who worked in your factories, ever since Lord Shaftesbury and the rest, that actually also had to be right. And now we're beginning to understand that our impact on the rest of the world really matters. And it's not just our direct impact, but for example, in climate change, we talk about scope 3 emissions. Otherwise, people were a long way away from you, but the bit of the machine that you use to make something that they make, you've got to have an interest as to whether those are made by people who are indentured laborers, who are slaved in one way or another. We have changed the way we look at business, and business needs to earn, for the very first time, I think, a license to operate of a kind which it never had to do before. So what we've added of recent years is a concern not just for the consumer, not just for the worker, but for those who help the supply of products and of services. And we, as individuals and as companies, are responsible for seeing whether we are profiting by modern slavery, profiting by companies that don't look after their workers, profiting by people who destroy the environment.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for sharing those thoughts. I wonder, Imran, if you would like to add anything to that.
Yeah, I completely, that completely resonates with me, what Lord Deben said there. It's really important to me as Chief Procurement Officer that my team see modern slavery and the wider economic crime and sustainability issues, all of that as relevant to part of their roles, beyond just the buying. Yes, we've got expert teams to provide insights and to work together with, so the responsibility is not solely ours as a function, but we play a hugely important role in ensuring suppliers are aware of how important this agenda is to us, by communicating with them, by having open dialogue with them about our expectations. And for me, we personally in procurement, we must create the right environment where suppliers come openly to us with issues as well, so we can resolve them together. The days are gone where these things should be hidden or not discussed. Actually creating an open environment where people can bring a concern and work it through is incredibly important.
Yeah, great, thank you. Justine, would you like to add something there?
Yeah, I think, from all of the work that I have done previously with businesses, it's very clear that there was quite often a very narrow view in terms of what businesses should focus on. And we've had businesses focus solely on supply chains, and businesses thinking, particularly in the financial services, only 7 or 8 years ago, talking about it not impacting them, and a real lack of understanding of how this could impact on financial services. But it's absolutely right, what Lord Deben and Imran have said already. Really, it's about understanding the totality of your business. Where is your reach, whether that's purely within the UK, whether that's much further afield. But it is very much about your own organisation, and understanding those elements of, where are we being supplied uniform from? Where are we being supplied in terms of our canteen? Where is our labour coming from? So I think all of those elements are really, really critical. And suppliers in particular, and the procurement element of that is really, really crucial, because you don't have transparency. And it's really important that you get those relationships right, because if you do get those relationships right, it makes it much easier to know and understand where your potential risks are, and then work with those who are most risky, potentially because they are in a risky location, or there are goods or services that we recognise as being risky, or the way in which temporary labour is sourced makes it risky. But really understanding that, and then knowing that businesses have to really focus on those key risks first.
Thanks, Justine. You mentioned levels of awareness, and I wanted to just come back to you and ask about, in your work, what you see as the greatest challenges and obstacles facing procurement departments when tackling modern slavery. Internally, is it levels of awareness that is a barrier to change, or an obstacle to overcome, or is it that more training's required, or what are some of the typical challenges that companies face when trying to address this through looking at their supply chains?
Well, I think it's all of the above, to be fair. I think there's absolutely a necessity to understand, to raise awareness, to educate people about where and how risks can manifest themselves, and taking simple steps. So, there are lots of people out there that want businesses to spend an absolute fortune on all of this, but actually it's good business. It's understanding where your risks are. It's knowing what questions to ask when you're working with a supplier or a third party. It's knowing who provides your recruitment, and it's then being able to ask those sensible questions. And remember, we always talk about compliance from a procurement perspective. We need to throw that word away in a way. We need to talk about continuous improvement. We really need to focus on always looking at the next thing, always making sure that we're not standing still. And I think my point about the financial sector 8 years ago was probably the case for many sectors and for many industries. I think there's a real understanding now that we need to do more. There are some businesses that are doing great work, and we can learn from that. And there are others that, quite frankly, are taking no interest in this whatsoever, whether that's a lack of knowledge and understanding, or whether that's just a complete disregard for the legislation. But I think what we need to do is remind everybody that workers are really at the heart of what we're talking about. And whether you are an individual member of the public, whether you are working in a procurement team, or you are a CEO of an international company, we all have a role and a moral obligation to do the right thing. We would not want any of our family members or any of our friends or neighbours to be involved in situations like this. And unfortunately, from my experience, we do see that happening all of the time. So, we need to dispel the myths around this is about people in third world countries, so to speak, or the developing world. It's very much here and now. It's here in the 21st century in the UK, and we just need everybody to sit up, take note, and actually take progressive and steps that will help us on an iterative basis to actually move forward.
Thanks, Justine. I particularly liked your comment about we need to throw away the word compliance and move towards continuous improvement. Imran, does that all ring true for you?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And we worked very closely with Justine on a tailored set of trainings and workshops for our entire procurement function last year. I mean, they were hugely valuable to us in terms of building capability and understanding amongst the team. And in my experience, if training isn't tailored and interactive, I personally find it can be very dull, and it doesn't build the awareness that you need, especially on such an important topic. And as Justine said, the examples that we had within our training were things that were happening in this country in this day and age, and that was really eye-opening for people to see in terms of just consciousness. So something we're acutely aware of when we were developing the training. We found the approach hugely successful. We put all of our team through it. 100% of the team said it enhanced their understanding of modern slavery generally and relevance to their role. But as mentioned before, we realised it's not just the procurement team that need to be aware of these things. So we're now looking to roll out further sessions to operational vendor management colleagues, others within the society, and we also hope to roll that training out further, or at least encourage our suppliers to go on that journey as well, so that they can sort of have those same thought processes as they look at their supply chains. It's also something which I firmly believe doesn't just stop with one training. The time moves on, people need refreshers, and it's something that will continue to be part of our program.
Absolutely. Lord Deben, I'm sure you would agree that continuous improvement is the way forward, and that we should seek to move away from compliance.
I don't think we should throw away the word compliance. I know exactly why Justine says that, but the truth is there are far too many companies that don't even comply with the very restricted demands, for example, of the Modern Slavery Act. I mean, when we did the first of the Sancroft-Tussell indices, we found that 38% of the top 100 people who were had the largest contracts with government were not obeying the law. So, I mean, it really is outrageous how many people feel that this is an unnecessary thing to be dealing with. The second thing is, I want to very much agree with people who remind businessmen that it's not something that happens only in India or in Pakistan or in China. We did some very important work for a major clothing company in Britain, and the very first, for all around the world, the very first examples of modern slavery came from Manchester. And you've only got to see what Boohoo has found and the situation in Leicester. You realise why quite a number of companies won't source in Leicester, because they don't believe that they can overcome the problems of modern slavery there. So we ought, secondly, to realise that there are an awful lot of companies that just don't think of this as a universal problem. All the indications are that it's increasing, if anything, in Britain, not decreasing. And thirdly, I do think it's useful to remind people of the particular areas where modern slavery is likely to occur. It usually happens either where the product is manufactured behind closed doors. In other words, transparency is the biggest enemy of modern slavery. Or it happens where people hardly really recognize that they are using a service. So car washes are a very good example where there's a lot of modern slavery. And the reason is, actually, most people can't remember the name of the car wash that they last had their car washed in. It's not something that you don't think through these things. So I think that third issue is very important, is to recognize there are some areas where this kind of activity is particularly noticeable. And that's why I think that the movement towards more and more stuff being bought online is a real issue, because in the retail trade, most of the people who work in shops are there on show, so to speak. They are there and they have to deal with customers. It's quite difficult to deal with your staff badly if you then want them to deal well with the customers. But there are an awful lot of people in the business of mail order where clearly people are not being paid properly, where they are not having, in effect, they are not even being paid the national minimum wage, leave alone a living wage. And of course, so much of this goes on behind closed doors. There's no interaction with the public. And that's an area, again, where if you're in the procurement world, you really need to make sure that you have visited without notice, actually have talked with other people who are using those particular suppliers or having their deliveries done by those delivery companies before you can be sure that you're not dealing with modern slavery.
Absolutely, and you say that this is something that's only getting worse, and certainly that through the pandemic, people have moved hugely to online retail away from shops, and it will mask all sorts of things. Imran, I would like to ask you about the program that you have, the Procurement for Mutual Good program at Nationwide. Could you tell us a bit more about this and how it works?
Absolutely. So Procurement for Mutual Good is our program for building a more diverse, more ethical and greener supply chain. So we know we've got a role to play in driving demand for greener products from responsible suppliers. And we're really committed to leverage our name and our procurement spend for a better future. So through the program, we're continually embedding sustainable considerations into the processes that we have for procurement. And that's everything from building internal requirements for new goods or services to setting new standards during supplier onboarding and contracting, and monitoring performance over time. To touch on Paul Debbin's point there about just making sure that we continually check in all this against the things that are important. So sustainability is really at the heart of our procurement. And under the programme, we've got a few focus areas under that umbrella. They're specifically around climate action, circular economy, supply chain diversity, social enterprises, prompt payment, and human and labour rights, which includes modern slavery. So this topic firmly sits underneath the Procurement for Mutual Good banner in terms of working with our suppliers and onboarding them. So we totally recognise that the work's never finished, and there's always more that we can do. But it's an agenda deeply connected to our purpose as a mutual, and therefore something we're very passionate about, and something that has a huge buy-in across the society.
Have you ever encountered a case of suspected slavery, forced labour, or coercion in your supply chain?
It's a good question. I'm pleased to say that we've not found to date a case of slavery in our supply chain, but I completely acknowledge that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, just because it hasn't been discovered. So, but through our supply chain tools, we did find a couple of cases where suppliers that we believe should be publishing a statement under the UK Modern Slavery Act haven't had one, and that allowed us to open a dialogue with them on this, and both have now published statements. That they've done the things that they should have done. And we know a statement only goes so far, but it does force an important internal conversation that can spur much more meaningful action to combat modern slavery. So again, it's about opening that conversation, no matter what the topic may be that comes to light. Certainly I take the stance that we'd rather use our position to support a supplier to remedy an issue and strengthen their controls, to mitigate the risk of modern slavery taking place, in its entirety.
Yeah, so rather than striking them off your procurement list, working with them to affect change.
Yes, absolutely, and we believe that's in the spirit of the UK Modern Slavery Act as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
You remember that, Hope, can I say this? You remember that Unilever's chairman said if they didn't find modern slavery in their supply chain, they hadn't looked hard enough. That their measure of success was that they actually found it. And it seems to me that that's quite a good comment for as diversified a business as theirs. I mean, I think rather different for somebody like Nationwide, but for Unilever, I thought it was a very brave statement to make. They were the first to produce a proper modern slavery document, as you know. But it really emphasized the fact that it's nothing it doesn't shame you if you find modern slavery. What shames you is if you don't do anything about it.
Absolutely.
Completely agree with that. That absolute honesty and that approach is one to be commended. Absolutely.
Yeah. We've talked quite a bit about we've heard about the range of suppliers and that I imagine can be quite a challenge from both sides, both from the company but also from the supplier angle. One option that some banks use is the services of benchmarking companies such as EcoVadis or Helios have FSQS system. And these are sustainability benchmarking services that can increase efficiency and reduce questionnaire fatigue on the part of the supplier. But I wonder whether they address the question of modern slavery adequately in their due diligence research. Justine, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the use of these benchmarking assessments of suppliers. How robust do you believe this information can be when it's provided by a sort of a third party?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I think they have a part to play, but if we think that we're putting all our eggs into that basket, then I would be very concerned. I think you need a multi-pronged approach. I think you really need to understand that and really take Lord Dieben's point about the compliance versus continuous improvement. But for me, we've got a lot of businesses at the moment saying we are compliant, but they're actually not doing very much. And, I was involved in drafting the Modern Slavery Act in Section 54, and I think it was a real step forward, but we need to remember that it is just a piece of paper, and actually what's really important is all of the work that happens underneath that. And some businesses are very loath to include too much information in those statements. We've seen some businesses that just year on year are regurgitating the same information. And then we've got other companies who are also relying on these types of platforms and are not doing much else aside from that. So I think it really is very much around a multi-pronged approach, having these types of platforms, making sure that we still use audits in the right way, that we do have supplier codes of conduct that really set out the relationship between the supplier and the business, and making sure that, as Imran said earlier, it's about working with suppliers to improve conditions. What we want to do is prevent it. We don't want to displace it. And this is quite often what happens when businesses walk away from suppliers.
If I may say so, I'm also concerned about these ways of doing it. I think that Justine is right. You should not rely only on that, the work of these agencies. Not only that, I also think that if you're not careful, this is an excuse for not doing the work yourself. I mean, dealing with modern slavery, dealing with these really important ethical subjects of procurement ought to be part of the business of those who are doing the procurement. It ought to be something they take responsibility for, but also that they take it as part of their job. And I'm always concerned about companies that say, oh, well, we're perfectly all right because we've got Mr. X who does it. I'm much more interested in whether Mr. X is the kind of person who makes sure that the business actually itself begins to take ownership of this whole program. And in Sancroft, when we're working, we're very, very clear about this. It's not about benchmarking. You may use a benchmark to point out to people that they've got a long way to go. You can use a benchmark to help people realize they've done some very successful things. But in the end, what you have to do if you're a proper consultant in this area is you've got to get them to take responsibility and ownership for this and to build a business in which this is part of the business operation.
I absolutely agree.
You're really in trouble, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think, a business cannot discharge its responsibilities by assuming that one of these platforms is undertaking their due diligence on their behalf. And I would say that, for the businesses where this is ingrained in their DNA, they will have a much better response because they will just know it, get it, and will know what steps to take. And that's where we need to take many businesses on a journey of discovery, of understanding.
And don't you think, Justine, that we ought to remind these businesses too, that in the end, if it goes wrong, it isn't the benchmark company which gets it in the neck, it's the business. So this is, I think it's a tremendously important part of the learning curve. That is, we now live in a world in which people do not expect there to be modern slavery. And even in companies who will talk about the socioeconomic groups which they serve really aren't interested in this. Absolute nonsense. There are always enough of them, enough people who are interested in this. And if it goes wrong, the reputational damage is enormous. Boohoo has suffered enormously because of the revelations. And it will go on suffering until it can actually prove to people that they have overcome these. That's why they've taken such very big efforts to try to overcome this problem, because they recognize that even though they're providing for a section of the community which some people rather snootily think are not very interested in this, they've learned that that's not so.
Imran, I wonder if you might like to add anything to these comments.
Yeah, I mean, look, I wholeheartedly, agree with both Justine and Lord Devlin on this. And at the end of the day, it's the end user and it's the end procurer of the service that is ultimately responsible. And from a PR perspective as well, if something terrible does happen, is the one that's in the papers or has the negative press associated with it. So it is the end user. I mean, for me, these are tools. They're part of the arsenal of things that you can use, and it's how you use them that's important. So for us, we've recently partnered with EcoVadis. Actually, we've just signed up to their service, as we're really conscious of the information asks placed on suppliers. And if there's a way to increase the efficiency of those asks so that the efforts are better spent on taking real action to face the issues that we face, like modern slavery and climate change, then we're all for it. But that said, we don't solely rely on EcoVadis score, given to a supplier, and nor would EcoVadis actually recommend us to do that. As I said, it's a tool to help us identify strengths and weaknesses, and that then allows us to prioritize our efforts and dig further into some of those weaknesses and collaborate with those suppliers to turn them into strengths. So I certainly don't believe it's a fix-all, and there's certainly no one solution that I know of that would get you that answer. It's part of an arsenal of tools that we must use as an educated procurement team.
Just continuing on the theme of the huge amount of work that complying or providing information to the company that's procuring can place on suppliers. I'm just thinking about the small suppliers and whether this places quite a burden on their resources. Justine, I think this is something that you've looked at. Are there particular things that large organizations such as Nationwide or any large organization that's procuring, are there things that they can do to help the smaller suppliers, provide them with the information they need, prove that they're working on this issue, without them becoming completely overwhelmed with supplying documents and that sort of thing?
Yeah, for me, I think the word that springs to mind is proportionality. So we need to be proportionate. And when we work to look at risk assessing for businesses, we're very much of the view, is this material to your business? Can you leverage your influence around those businesses? Because what we need to do is we need to create an environment where we say we're intolerant of this type of activity and behavior. But you're absolutely right. There are many businesses that feel like they are discharging their responsibility. It's not their job to keep on top of suppliers 2, 3, 4 tiers down, but I'm sorry, that is exactly what you should be doing. You should be offering help to those who are less able, don't have the resources, don't have the capacity or capability necessarily to do that. And it's about education, it's about setting expectations. So, businesses having a very, very clear code of conduct, setting expectations, what you can expect from us, what we expect from you, making it clear that modern slavery is something that we are trying to prevent, but actually it could happen. And what we will do is work with you if that is the case. But what we want you to do is to take appropriate steps around due diligence. So think about those other suppliers that you may then be subcontracting with, to make sure that you are not just circumventing risk by not taking that appropriate action. So it's very much around those assurances, but having in place strong relationships, a strong set of codes of conduct that you can then draw on, and that you're there to help and support, rather than the small supplier feeling like they will be just cut aside. Because I think that's the worst thing that can happen, because we're talking about workers at the end of the day. And we put workers into a much more serious position if we don't kind of step in and try and help. So, my message would be that's exactly what we need to do. And I think the one thing that I was really pleased about when we brought in Section 54 into the Modern Slavery Act was the fact that we made it the responsibility of the board to approve the statement. I think what that does is it takes it out of a CSR, HR responsibility, which many of these businesses had placed it into, and it is now front and center within the board. Yes, we still have much work to do, because we still have businesses that don't seem to care or take any notice of their legal obligations, but we definitely are moving in the right direction. And for me, it is very much around really making sure that those relationships help us to get to where we need to. And that's offering help to those who are less able to do it themselves.
Imran, are there particular things that you're doing that help the smaller suppliers?
Yeah, I mean, we're very conscious of our role to play in supporting smaller businesses, and the different expectations that we should have of them versus multinationals. They do have a different capability and ability to enact things. Last year we actually updated our third-party code of practice to clearly illustrate the differing requirements we've got of micro, small, and medium enterprises compared with the larger organisations. So putting a higher higher standard, if you like, and an expectation on those that can manage it. We've also just built that into our new source to exit system. We're about to go live with a new source to exit system powered by Cooper, and we're actually sort of programming that in to it as well. And our next step is really to look at options for coaching and training some of the smaller suppliers on material sustainability topics too. I think that's the next step for us, is to really help them on the journey.
Yeah, fascinating. That sounds really great. Lord Deben, you mentioned earlier the Sancroft-Tussell report that your organisation was involved with, I think last year or the year before. And this looked at modern slavery within government procurement. Do you see similar challenges between the public sector and the private sector in addressing this subject?
Well, I do think that that Justine is right, that the most important, or one of the most important elements of the legislation is now that it's got to be signed off by the main board. But I have to say that when one approached the 38 companies that really were not meeting their minimum obligations, the general view was, oh, well, this was, one of these things, just a mistake. I mean, I'm frightfully sorry. One of them was one of the major accountancy firms responsible for getting other people to do this job properly. So I rather enjoyed that, explaining that it was no good just passing it off like that. But it seems to me that the real problem is that we have this phrase modern slavery, which I find a very difficult phrase, because when people say slavery, they immediately don't think it's modern. So then you put the word modern in front of it, and then they still think of it in the terms of the obvious chains around the ankles, slaves out in the sunshine in the West Indies. They don't think of it of poor, pathetic people from Eastern Europe who've had their, who have been frightened by believing that they are illegal immigrants when very often they're not, and have had their passports taken away from them, and whom, if you met in the street, apart from the fact that they probably don't speak English, you would think of as a normal worker going to work. And indeed, that's what they do. And yet there are people who have these holds over them. So the obviousness is not there. And that's why I'm not sure that we don't have to have a better word for this, because what they really are people who are being used for the benefits of other people and are being treated in a way which is not humane and which we wouldn't ever allow our children to be treated like. And for me, that's the question I always have to ask. Are the people who are making this, providing this service, doing what I am paying for, are they being treated in a way in which I would feel was decent? And I do think bringing back that word decency, this is indecent employment. And bringing that word decency into it very often gets people to be a little more concerned. And I've always thought of a particular chairman of a company which was falsely accused of behaving badly to its workers in Bangladesh, saying to me, look, I wouldn't sleep at night if I thought I behaved like that. And I just think all of us have to say, can I honestly sleep at night running a business, being a procurement officer, doing my job, and knowing that the people I work with, I'm looking after in that very primary, extremely basic sense.
Yeah, this subject of the word modern slavery, it comes up very, very often in our discussions. And is it actually hindering the work that we're all doing in taking this work forward, because it does conjure up images of practices from years gone by, and it doesn't help to focus people's minds on what's happening, particularly in the UK. But terminology it's difficult to change when that's become the term that everybody uses now. I'd like to ask one final question to all of you. And Lord Deben, maybe I could start with you. Many of our listeners on these podcasts are starting on the journey towards addressing the modern slavery within their organizations. Some are less advanced than others. What advice would you give to an organization just starting on this journey, starting to work with their suppliers? Where should they focus their attention in the early days of their work?
Oh, I think you have to do it in a practical way. You start by looking at those businesses who are in your supply chain, who are your prime suppliers. Mind you, before you do that, you look at your own business just to make sure you've got it right. Then your prime suppliers. Then you redefine prime suppliers to make it direct suppliers. In other words, people who directly supply you but may not be prime ones. And then you move from that to the prime suppliers of your prime suppliers. In other words, you begin to move down the line. And in the meantime, you begin to get to know your prime suppliers better and begin to recognize that some of them will be doing this job properly themselves. And so you leave them to the end. And you deal with those prime suppliers whom you really feel aren't doing the job properly. And what's more, you lay this out as a program that you're on this journey to eradicate any modern slavery in your supply chain, in order that people will know that because you've done that before, if you're criticized, you can genuinely say, we have a program, we can't do everything at once, but we're starting with the prime, then with the direct, and then with the prime of our direct suppliers. And we're doing it in that order in order that we do it properly. And I think that's very important, because otherwise, sometimes people get started on the journey and then get deflected because some organization, some competitor, very often, this has become a real issue of competition. Some competitor has put it about that you're not doing something about some aspect. And it's very important for people to recognize that you do have a proper program, properly thought out, of the same quality as anything else in a business, financial supplying, financial structure, all the things that you'd expect to be done properly in a business. This must be just as proper.
Imran, what advice would you give?
That was actually very good advice that Lord Deben gave in terms of programmatically working it through. I mean, the things I would add to it are, I think it's incredibly important to raise internal awareness of the topic as a whole. So the education of what it is, how to spot it, the sorts, how to have the right conversations with your suppliers, with your internal stakeholders as well, who are requesting those services. That's to me the place to start. You have to begin there, and then, as Dr. says, then prioritize your efforts. Where you think the highest risk is, and methodically work through. The other piece that I think is, two pieces I think are incredibly valuable. One is that conversation and that awareness, being clear to your supply base through forums, whether it's events, conferences, etc. Talking about this subject quite publicly and the importance to the organisation of it, to raise that awareness. And the third thing, the last thing around metrics is, particularly if you're a procurement function, work towards a balanced scorecard, right? So it's not just about cost reductions and contract terms and risk that you should be looking at as a procurement function, but these broader topics, whether it's modern slavery, whether it's climate change, whether social value, etc. Have those things embedded into your scorecards that get measured on and get rated against, and make it balanced so it becomes real in the day-to-day job.
Great, that's really great advice. Thanks, Justine. Would you like to add anything there?
So for businesses who think pressing down on price, quality and timeliness, and then standing back and saying it's not our fault when modern slavery or worker exploitation is occurring, I think need to really take a look at themselves. So if you are pressing as hard as you possibly can to get the lowest price possible somewhere down the supply chain, you are complicit in worker exploitation, because there is potentially no way that a supplier or suppliers several tiers down are going to be able to make sufficient money to pay their workers, as Lord Deben said, decent work and decent pay. So for me, that's really, really crucial. And I think that is part of a procurement element, but I also think it's part of the ethos of a company as well. So, getting a board to say, well, actually, let's work this through and work out what the cost of goods and services would be if we paid, for example, within the UK, the national minimum wage or living wage, then I think, looking at that more closely is fundamental. I agree around education. I think it should be top to bottom and bottom up. It's not just about those who have a particular function. I think it needs to happen across the piece. And I really do think that people need to assess where they are and where they need to get to. So that kind of gap analysis, really understanding, well, where are the gaps before you start trying to work out where your risks are, because you're kind of fishing in a big pool. So really understanding what you've got in place, what you potentially need, how you're going to fill that gap, then start to look at where your risks are, and just don't be afraid to talk about the subject. Being open, I think, is very well received, and it comes back to some of the previous comments around businesses saying, well, we found it, and we should celebrate the fact that we found it, and also celebrate the fact that we've done something helpful with it. We've remediated, and we've worked out our lessons learned and how we're going to apply that back into the business. And I think that's absolutely crucial.
Thanks, Justine. That's some really great food for thought and great advice. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. Thank you all for your insights and experiences and comments. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I hope that all our listeners have enjoyed it as well. Thank you again for making the time to be with us today. This podcast is part of a series of virtual discussions we have published as part of our work addressing modern slavery and human trafficking. We are working in partnership with the UK Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner to explore the ways in which the financial services sector can identify and prevent modern slavery and human trafficking. If you have time, I would encourage you to listen to the other podcasts in this series, which involve a range of expert speakers and highlight the excellent work being done by many of the industry's champions to address this terrible crime.
Thank you for listening to the latest Themis podcast. We hope you found it interesting and informative. If you would like to find out more about Themis, get in touch with us via our website, www.crime.financial. You can also subscribe for future news and interviews.